Welcome back to the Piping Pastor Theology Talks. Today we'll be concluding our discussion of aliens and Christian theology. Well, this afternoon I am enjoying my very first bowl of Bijou by Cornell and Deal. It is a Turkish Oriental and Virginia mixture. I'm, of course, smoking it in my Curtis Mearsome Church Warden. And I have to say, so far, I'm really enjoying it. All the flavor notes are there. They stand out really well. I was concerned that one would take over the other, but it's very well balanced. The flavor kind of initially hits you, especially on the retrohale, with that Turkish Oriental, and then it finishes really smoothly with that bready Virginia. So, tobacco reviews aren't normally my thing, but it's a new one. I thought I'd share my thoughts, and I'm liking it so far. It's very subtle. I probably wouldn't pair it with coffee next time. I think this is more of an Earl Grey tea kind of a blend. Might be a bit more floral if I didn't have the coffee with it. But nice altogether. Well, back to our discussion of theology and aliens. I have my notes here, so I won't get all sidetracked. Discussed last time that in my guilty pleasure show, Ancient Aliens, they oftentimes take ancient texts, either from the Bible or Epic of Gilgamesh, the ancient Sumerian text about Baal worship, sometimes stuff from Norse paganism, and they'll say, okay, you know what? Aliens visited us. There was alien contact, and these ancient peoples didn't understand it, so they recorded it as gods. Now, that follows the very worst models of liberation theology, where you're explaining to a native peoples that what they thought they understood as a metaphysical truth is in reality something else. It's not chi, it's the Holy Spirit. That's not Thor in the heavens, that's just lightning. God is above all that stuff. That kind of thing, right? But the text that they most often refer to, as I mentioned, is the text in Genesis that refers to the Nephilim, and the text in Ezekiel 1 with the angels and the four-wheeled structures. Now, the argument about the Nephilim is that, of course, the story of the Nephilim is that these are, you have angels come down, they have relations with human females, and they have these hybrid children, and these are the giants of old, the heroes. There's not a whole lot of wiggle room there in terms of explanation and commentary. I'll start there. Some people have suggested that that there is this intermediary layer of angels, that you have the angels who were initially rebellious with the morning star, those who remain loyal to God, but of those who remain loyal to God, some of them are kind of like, oh yeah, I'll kind of follow the rules, but I'm going to go to earth and do my thing, right? And they are punished in a different kind of way. And there's some rabbinic interpretations of this in the Talmud, and some Christian commentaries on the New Testament side, and various things like that. But the truth of the matter is, no one really knows. All we have is text. So, and the text says what the text says. Angels came down mixed with humans. Now, the ancient astronaut theorist or ancient aliens people will say, well, that's aliens, right? Aliens visited the Earth, they intermixed their DNA with humans, and that's how we go from being Neanderthal dominant to Homo sapien. But there's absolutely no evidence of that. There's no evidence of, some kind of radically different change in our DNA in the evolution of humanity. Right? And I discussed that kind of in theological anthropology. series I did on theological anthropology, right? We have the progression of humanity, but there's no like hard right turn without explanation, right? I mean, there's some missing information here and there. We don't know everything, right? But it's not something where every human archaeologist and anthropologist is like, well, yeah, 13,000 years ago, humanity just went off a cliff in terms of evolutionary leaps and bounds. So the idea that aliens visited and intermix their DNA, doesn't really hold up in a scientific manner. It doesn't really hold up in a narrative fashion either, because if that were the case, and aliens did come down and intermingle with humans and create these giants, these heroes, and so on and so forth, I would think that the more evolved hybrid mix of human would have been dominant, just from an argumentation standpoint. But in any case, there's nothing in the Bible that really gets further into that than what we actually have. So everything else is supposition, right? So they make this theory, they kind of throw this claim out there and are like, oh, well, this is where we have all the Greek heroes and all these people like Hercules and demigods and all these various different cultures. It's an intermingling of aliens and humans, right? It's like, okay, so and it just stopped happening 4,000 years ago for some reason, right? So you can make the argument if you want, but you can't really make it from the biblical text. There's not enough there for that. But the one that they most often times will point to with alien visitation is Ezekiel chapter 1. In Ezekiel chapter 1, we have the angels coming to visit and Ezekiel seeing them. And I had the verses here, so I won't go rabbit trail. But in the verses 4 and 5, it says, I looked and saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning surrounded by brilliant light, and in the center of fire looked like glowing metal. So these people say, oh, well, he's seeing a spaceship land. And in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was human. So these creatures come out that he can't really describe accurately. He's not really sure what they are, but these creatures come out of this phenomenon, right? As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature with its 4 faces. And this was the appearance and structure of the wheels. They sparkled like topaz, and all 4 looked alike. Each appeared to be made like a wheel, intersecting a wheel, so perpendicular. As they moved, they could go in any one of the 4 directions that the creatures faced. The wheels did not change direction as the creatures went. Their rims were high and awesome, and all 4 rims were full of eyes all around. So they look at this and say, okay, well, Ezekiel saw some spaceships land, and these aliens come out on these like specialized vehicles that don't exist in any kind of record anywhere else, and they're impossible to make. Perpendicular wheels that move like that, right? So like, well, that must have been a spaceship, and he misinterpreted it. What's discounted there is the truth in Revelation. So it really could have literally been angels coming down on these kind of wheels, right? But more likely, if we apply historical and contextual and literary criticism to it, we can see that this is a symbolic representation of God's presence on the earth, because that's what Ezekiel was meant to see. You have to look at the impetus for the text. Why is it there, right? Why would Ezekiel see this? Why would Ezekiel write this down? And more importantly, why would the rabbinic scholars, when they codified and the codex of the Tanakh, keep this in there, right? Because it has meaning. There's a purpose of it. The purpose of it is to demonstrate God's presence on earth and what it does in relationship to us. The rabbinic scholars and the Talmudic impressions or interpretations have said this is the Machaba. My biblical Hebrew is horrendous, but the throne of God. We'll stick with English. The throne of God. So this is God's presence on the earth. And the 4 faces represent 4 different things. And there's some other later interpretations that say, okay, it's a precursor to the 4 Gospels and so on and so forth. And they have these little charts where they lay out like, oh, the ox represents this and this gospel and so on and so forth. But We'll stick to the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible interpretation for the moment. But these four faces represent, power and knowledge and strength and all these other different characteristics of God, right? And they're facing in each one of the four directions so they can see in each one of the four directions. The wheels are able to move in each one of the four directions instantaneously, and they have eyes all around. So there is knowledge, power, movement, presence anywhere and everywhere. So the presentation of God's throne on earth, the presentation of God's presence on earth, is that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. Because God can be anywhere in any of the four directions. God can see anywhere in any of the four directions, and God's power is represented in any four of the directions. And from the Hebrew understanding of geography, if you're covering north, south, east, and west, you got everything covered. So these thrones represent God being everywhere. That's the purpose of the text. That's a symbolic representation of the text. But if you don't study theology, if you don't study biblical studies, if you don't look at contextual and literary criticism of the text and really dive into all these various different aspects that theologians and biblical study scholars look alike, and you just read the text face value and say, okay, what did he really see? And you apply a literalist, materialist, minimalist kind of a view to it, and tack onto that, you're either agnostic or atheist, then you're looking at what you understand to be a record of a historical account of something that literally happened, and you try to apply your method of interpretation. And so, ta-da, aliens. Doesn't mean they're actually in the Bible. And in point of fact, they're not. It's just an uninformed reading of the text. So if you want to engage in ancient text, by all means do so. But to try to properly interpret ancient texts takes a lot more study than just reading them. Especially ancient texts written, thousands and thousands of years ago, right? You need to understand the history of the people. You need to understand their perspective. You need to understand their religio-philosophic traditions. And you need to understand the impetus or the drive behind writing the text. And then you can perhaps offer some commentary on it. If you just look at a sign for Starbucks, I think I've mentioned this before, the symbol for Starbucks is the sign of the green goddess, right? So with, knowing no context or whatever, you can look at a Starbucks and say, oh, it's a temple for the green goddess. Look, the symbol's right there. That's what it is. Those people going in are offering their tithes and offerings, and they're being given the sacred liquor that enables them to heighten their senses so they can more clearly understand the will of the goddess. Without context, misinterpretation happens. So, do your reading, do your research, do some study though, and as always, seek out the experts, see what they say, and weigh that into. But in any case, I'm going to return back to my brand new tobacco here. My tobacco acquisition disorder recent find. Thank you, Parsimonious Piper, for coining that phrase. Even if you didn't coin it and someone else thought of it, I'm going to credit you with that. And I'm going to enjoy the rest of my afternoon. So I hope you do as well. Have a lovely week. As always, happy reading.